Hi, I'm Justin King with the New America Foundation. I'm here with Devin Fergus.
Yes.
Devin is a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and an assistant professor of history at the City University of New York's Hunter College. Devin, thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Justin.
I think the historical perspective that you provided us with today, I think, is really, really interesting. Can you tell us just a little bit about what the head of the CFPB, when the Bureau is created and up and running, what does history tell us about some of the challenges that they're going to face?
Sure. Perhaps a skeptical Congress or members of Congress, a faction in Congress, and some skeptics in the public. And I go back, look at the New Deal, the American Liberty League and Al Smith and Father Coughlin and that sort of faction. So great, as well as not to mention the financial sector and the business sector, who were great skeptics of FDR. Mm-hmm. So they'll face skeptics in terms of public policy and in terms of people who are coming out of the financial sector as well.
One of the things we've heard frequently is that implementing this bill, which is so heavy on regulation mm-hmm. and so heavy on study mm-hmm. And sort of future implementation of policies yet to be decided, it's going to be really a question of leadership.
Sure.
And people have said that it's going to be 2 years down the road before there's any significant rulemaking or impact from this new regulatory regime and the new Financial Protection Bureau. What does that mean?
It means a return to the cult of the CEO. But the cult of the regulatory CEO, right? What in part history suggests, both in the Securities and Exchange Commission and more recently something like the Environmental Protection Agency, is that strong leadership initially is vitally important. In the Securities and Exchange Commission, strong leadership came in the form of Joseph P. Kennedy. In the Environmental Protection Agency, it comes in William Ruckelshaus. And again, especially with Ruckelshaus, vitally seen as a person of great integrity, seen as a person knowledgeable and a person who's fervent about social and particularly environmental issues. And so the respect from his peers or her peers, the respect of people who are part of the movement, as well as someone whose integrity is seen is almost impeccable. Again, like a Ruckelshaus, it would be the ideal sort of profile of a CFPB leader.
What happens 2 years down the road? Does the sort of impetus fade? Does the sort of public's awareness of a need for these new rules and these new regulations fade?
Again, Ruckelshaus is a useful example to go back to. Ruckelshaus in the first administration, Ruckelshaus heads the EPA. Mm-hmm. In the second administration, Ruckelshaus shifts to justice. Yet still, the EPA remains a vital part of the administration. So it's important to lay the groundwork with strong leadership, and then in a few years, that individual perhaps can move on to another position, and it create a smooth transition of leadership. And then Ruckelshaus, of course, comes back in the 1980s when the EPA is in part largely gutted by this person. And in part because she sees the federal government as being too bloated, and the EPA is perhaps the sort of embodiment of that too big federal government. And so Ruckelshaus comes back in the 1980s to take over that agency to restore it back to its quote former glory and influence.
So history tells us, looking at the history of the EPA mm-hmm. and the SEC,
exactly,
that there is a rocky road ahead for the mm-hmm. CFPB, and depending on sort of the leadership of the organization, mm-hmm. potentially a real up and down in terms of the role of the organization.
Precisely, and again, what Kennedy and Ruckelshaus do is they get people, people who are believers in the organization, in the agency. And once those people are in place, they're allowed the agency to flourish and continue. But again, strong leadership is vitally important.
And it's not just that top line. I think that's a critical point. Is that it's the talent that comes that follows that is equally important.
Both Paul Volcker and Elizabeth Warren have stressed, especially Warren, has stressed how vital, and what I'll call, use the phrase, grassroots regulators, how vital grassroots regulators have been, and that they wanted to do the right thing, but there was no leadership at the top. And again, there's a distinction between the grassroots regulators. These are the career regulators in the field, the career examiners at the OTS, OCC, particularly the Federal Reserve, and then the grass top regulators, and those are the federal appointees. Right. And it's vitally important to have grass top regulators who can believe in the cause and who are supportive, because it has so much impact on the morale of grassroots regulators. Another example would be out of the Justice Department. There's a perhaps not well-known book written by a guy named Brian Landsberg. Landsberg was a regulator for the Justice Department attorney in the 1950s and 60s. And in his book, it's like memoir, he talks about the sea change that exists from the shift from the Eisenhower administration and his reluctance to enforce federal policy to the Kennedy administration to support of federal policy, and how that sea change made a difference on the ground as Justice Department officials tried to enforce federal law in places like Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana and the Deep South.
Right.
And so, again, the importance of leadership at the top and what the message it sends to the grassroots regulators. A more recent example, the OCC, Office of Control of the Currency, in 2000. The OCC, again, does this study, does this report, and it talks about a rampant systemic risk created by payday lending and the rent-a-bank arrangements that these payday lenders have with these national banks, these rent-a-bank arrangements. They said that it's not only creating systemic risk, but it's also creating great harm for customers and borrowers of the bank, right? But there's little follow-up on that. Why? Because it's a change in administration, and the previous administration to the current one basically has no political will to enforce what the OCC, and the OCC is one of the sort of more, quote, slothful regulators, I mean, as some critics say. And the OCC, what the OCC sees as a major burgeoning problem in terms of systemic risk created by the rent-a-bank arrangements. There's no support at the top to enforce these sort of policies of the OCC.
I think that's a terrific point on which to wrap up. I think the upshot message for me, having you here today, is those that forget the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it. So your perspective has really been invaluable. I want to thank you.
Thanks so much, Justin.
Great.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you very much.